Hello and welcome to the podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name is George Miller, and in this programme I'm talking to Rick Fantasia, who's Professor of Sociology at Smith College. In his most recent article in Le Monde Diplomatique, Rick analyses the relationship between America's universities, identity-focused campus politics, and the US left. Has social solidarity been supplanted by identity issues? And if so, what are the consequences? When I spoke to Rick on the phone recently, I began with a much-cited notion of the US as a classless society, and asked Rick if you could tell me more about how that idea operates.
There's a long-standing kind of public narrative of classlessness in the US, and it also floats around in the belief system of many, if not most, Americans. At the same time as the material reality of American society is one of extreme class fullness, and that is also very powerful, and I would say increasingly so in recent years. Nevertheless, the language of class is very undeveloped among Americans. That is, its terminology, its bases. Are we talking about income or wealth or education or occupation or neighborhood? All of these in some combination. But then what combination? All of that is quite a confused discourse. But people use euphemism and people use ways of explaining concrete circumstances through a lens that could be also seen as a class perspective. Part of the problem also is that there have been very few organizations in the US, political movements or political parties, who've advanced an explicit language of class, and especially, and at least since the beginning of the post-war period, post-World War II period. And that includes much of, say, the trade union movement in the US. So Americans haven't traditionally heard the language of class in our political culture. And if you combine that with the relentless sort of individualism of American culture, class has been rendered almost unthinkable at the same time as the material reality of social inequality has been glaring. So even though American society has been dominated by the largest corporations on the planet, Americans still have a difficult time conceptualizing class and understanding it in political terms. In some sense, it's why class has been written out of the political culture in the US itself. That is, the domination of the political culture by large corporations and the money they provide to political candidates kind of ensures that class will be a kind of minimal consideration in the language of politics.
I wanted to turn now, Rick, to the institution of the university in the United States, because you focus on that institution in your piece in Le Monde Diplomatique.
Yes.
And you highlight its role in being the institution par excellence for setting the progressive agenda and the terms of the debate. And at the same time, of course, universities are not microcosms of the whole of society. They tend to be, in the US, expensive places. They tend to be selective and to varying degrees elitist, and therefore not representing the full sort of spectrum of the classes in the States. And I wondered, what do you think has flowed from that agenda-setting role that the universities have made for themselves?
It's a good question. I would say that first, it should be recognized, I think, that the field of higher education in the U.S. is massive and includes literally thousands of colleges and universities, and ordered in an extremely hierarchized way. That is, along with the thousands of public 2-year community colleges, we call them. There are 4-year state colleges, there are public universities, and there's also then a relatively small number of very visible, very expensive, elite private colleges and universities. And it's true, here's where the perspective that celebrates group identity and difference seems and I have to emphasize seems because I haven't done systematic research. It's just my own observations. I teach in one of these places. It seems particularly pervasive, this point of view. At the same time, it's an emphasis, a political perspective, that is also present throughout higher education. That's not simply the elite universities, but they tend to be, I would say, ideological trendsetters, and particularly because and where humanities disciplines have had a measure of influence in shaping the nature of the political discourse. But let me be clear that social difference and social identity are not problems in themselves. They are ways of conceptualizing the world that ought to be developed. It, to me, is perfectly understandable that students would want to explore these issues, particularly at their stage of life. My concern, though, has to do with a politics that doesn't seem to offer any clear route to social solidarity. And to me, this is social solidarity, and this is, I've written several books about this, is crucial for the working class in the US because solidarity is and always has been its fundamental, really its only source of social power. And since social solidarity is the foundation of any just social order that people, progressives, and many students would want to bring, it concerns me that there's no clear link between the focus on identity and group difference and how that could eventually, in some way, translate into a politics of social solidarity.
You also focus on the shift in the form which activism takes, not just in universities, but in wider society, and how it's gone from, I suppose one could crudely characterize it as sort of real world engagement to an online world. And you've got a very, I thought, potent comparison between this form of social shaming and the medieval charivari. I wondered if you could just pursue that comparison a little bit and talk about why it struck you as so telling.
Yes, that's a good point. I'm not a historian, so I can't speak with great authority about the experience of the charivari, or as it been called by British historians, rough music played itself out in medieval and late medieval Europe. But yes, it was a form of collective social shaming and social control that reined in various forms of transgressive behavior, particularly sexual behavior and marital infidelity and those kinds of things, in which a townspeople, a village, would mobilize to embarrass the transgressor, bring them out, usually would tie them to the back of a donkey facing backward with funny hats, and serenade them through the village as a method of social shaming. In terms of the contemporary forms of what some have called calling out culture, it seems to me that it's a political practice that operates largely by generating guilt. That is, not to mobilize people to act collectively against some common foe, but to attempt to guilt them, to defeat them publicly, to shame them. And these guilt seems to me to be a demobilizing impulse, not a mobilizing one. People never mobilize on the basis of feeling guilt. And in these online interactions, but not only online, I would say sometimes classroom interactions at the university and in informal conversations, it's meant to show oneself as being more aware than others. As part of this, I think call-out culture tends to freeze political discussion and debate, not encourage it. And what I've observed anyway is that those most involved in calling out others for their ignorance are often attempting to advance themselves by stigmatizing others. Ironically, that's exactly what racists do. They denigrate, quote, outsiders by announcing themselves as being among the, quote, insiders. So there are stakes involved in these interactions and in this political practice in which recognition and credit from others can be gained by putting oneself forward as being more aware, more, quote, woke than others. And in the piece, I quoted Assam Ahmad in the article, who notes that call-out culture is a public performance through which one is able to demonstrate their wit and their political purity at the expense of others. And it seems to me that combination of dynamics is not a combination that can lead to the kinds of social solidarity that I think are absolutely essential, if, particularly in American society, if we're going to be able to take on the power of the largest corporations.
As you say, it doesn't contribute to a genuine and lasting form of social solidarity. It's of the moment, as you quote, it's theatrical, it's dramatic, but it doesn't seem to have any real lasting positive impact. And it may even entrench certain discourses and send them underground, may it not?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it freezes political discussion in that way and means that people don't sort of advance their ideas and their views because they're afraid they're going to be called out. Yes, I guess you could see it as almost a form of social solidarity in itself against those who would transgress the accepted bounds. And it seems to me not the most didactic or most kind of effective way to mobilize people, to bring them into one's circle.
Returning to this sort of central question of social solidarity and how it may be achieved. I mean, I was thinking about an example that you quote in your piece, where you point out that research has shown that the police in the United States have killed a higher absolute number of white people than black people, but it is the case that they have killed a disproportionate number of black people. Of course, you're not for a moment suggesting that Black Lives Matter is not a valuable way for someone to use their political energies.
That's right.
But in quoting those figures, what do you think it is pointing to, or in terms of thinking about what can effectively be done about a clear problem? Yes. What is thinking about those figures actually, how does it help?
That's a good question, important question. First of all, let me say that by citing those statistics, those were not mine, those were of a political scientist who's arguing a similar point, I think, and that is that in the U.S., the working class is not white, it's not black, it is multinational, and it's multi-ethnic. It's made up of lots of different groups. And that seems to me a fundamental fact that a lot of activists tend to miss, partly because they want to be seen as advancing their anti-racist credentials. But it seems to me that it's important to sort of understand it, but then to quickly recognize, yes, the point that you make or in your question is that disproportionately, police departments target African American men in the U.S., even though the numbers of white, black, Latino, others are, in terms of police violence, are also extremely high. The fight for racial justice doesn't go away when we point this out. It must be engaged in U.S. society, this struggle. It's a society with a deeply rooted system of racial stratification. The criminal justice system is heavily skewed against black men. There's a racial separation and racial inequality in the housing and in neighborhoods. Racial differences are still inscribed in labor markets, and those must be countered, and they are countered. They're essential, these struggles, for advancing democratic participation in U.S. society, and particularly so, I would emphasize, at this moment when the government is being led by those who have clear fascist and white supremacist tendencies. We're not in a normal moment here.
Yes.
And so the struggle against attacks on racial and sexual minorities must be fierce. But if the struggles for social justice must be engaged by all, and I think they must, they have to be framed as struggles to which all can be enjoined. that means that the framework of civil rights, the framework that says that the fight to include those who've been traditionally excluded from having certain rights and resources and recognition, has become, in my view, limited as a framework for mobilization. In the context of the neoliberal political order and economic order, struggles for the inclusion of previously excluded groups seemed to me to make less sense as a primary political strategy, not as a strategy in every situation, of course, but as a primary long-term political strategy where the bases of what once defined the nature of inclusion, meaning regulated labor markets, union rights, stable immigration flows, those things are now being dismantled for everyone. And so the nature of inclusion and exclusion needs to be reconsidered in that light, I would think. What does the struggle for inclusion and civil rights that are advancing civil rights mean when everyone is now in the process of being excluded? And on what basis can groups be mobilized to struggle together for each other? That is, I want to push away from an emphasis on guilt toward one of solidarity. That room must be made in our political discourse for mutual interest that encourages and promotes collective participation across social divisions, and that includes racial divisions. In this process, struggles over civil rights for some become part of a broader struggle to advance social, political, and economic rights for all. Struggles for racial and gender and sexual inequality, or against inequality, are struggles for social justice and should be framed as that. And that is why I drew upon in my piece the example of the labor movement as a movement that in practice always has to negotiate and overcome social differences. The labor movement also historically has been at the forefront of struggles over racism and racial injustice in the U.S. historically. The Scottsboro Boys in the 1920s, 1930s, 20s, I believe, was a struggle that was led by the labor movement and the Communist Party in the U.S., and that must become, again, the practice of the trade union movement. You can point to examples of the very civil rights movement in which the United Auto Workers played a quite important role. There's a reason why that was, and that had to do with the interests of the trade union movement in breaking down social divisions. And that has to be re-engaged again. I'm not just sort of saying this. Militants in the labor movement fully understand this and push to promote it. So I don't want to suggest that I'm offering something new. It's known and it's struggled over.
So what would you say, Rick, in conclusion? I mean, in your piece yourself, you say the workplace is not the only site of social solidarity in US society. And you've been talking about some of the ways in which in a neoliberal work environment, rights have been significantly eroded and union activity has been made much more problematic. So, I mean, in conclusion, is it possible, is it conceivable that the workplace may have in fact been superseded as the sort of key site of beginning to build the kind of social solidarity that you've been describing?
Yes. It has been superseded to the extent that the largest corporations have been successful in breaking and battering down the labor movement in the U.S. to the extent that they have. I used the labor movement in the article as an exemplar, as an ongoing project of solidarity that could serve as a model, again, because solidarity is the only source of social power that the working class has had, and to ignore it in favor of this exclusive focus on group identity and difference leaves the U.S. working class vulnerable to overwhelming corporate power. There is still a working class at some stage of formation and deformation in the U.S. It is not necessarily the only one. Community struggles in cities across the United States have played an important role in providing a forum for solidarity across group differences. I think the crisis of climate change offers a telling and crucial example of a sphere of mobilization that must be fought across social differences. The Amazon is burning for all of us, not just the working class. But the working class exists in the US. We can only even imagine that it's been superseded, not because there are not still massive numbers of workers, but because their visibility has been, the very visibility of class as a social construct has been lost because there's no one there representing them. There are trade unions, but those trade unions are on the defensive. They've been battered. So in a sense, corporations have been, to a large degree, successful in beating back a trade union movement that once shaped the political economy and the social life in the United States. But there's no, it seems to me, no other way for the United States to advance unless there is a working class that is more or less organized, that has more or less of a strong voice in offering up a different perspective. I think in the Democratic Party, for example, it's being recognized now that having let the trade union movement lapse as a source of political support has really hurt the Democratic Party in favor of corporate interests that have been allowed to kind of shape the kind of third way politics in the United States. So there is a working class. It is mobilizing still, and particularly in areas where it was once weak. And I want to say more than that. The working class and the trade union movement did not organize vibrantly among women workers, for example, or among immigrant workers. That is now being, if not reversed, challenged within the trade union movement. And there's a tremendous amount of activity simply to hold traditional ground and to begin to advance among new groups of workers. That's not going to go away, but it's not going to become a political force without an ideological battle over the question of solidarity, it seems to me, in the society more generally. And the trade union movement is in a position to be able to advance that, in a sense, more clearly than any other organized political tendency in the U.S. That's both why I see it as an important important model, but I also recognize that the trade union movement has been battered over the last 30 years. My last point is not simply to end on a happy ending. This is not Hollywood, but to suggest that, I know Le Monde Diplomatique has written about the massive teacher strikes that have emerged over the course of the last 2 or 3 years in the U.S., where school teachers and school employees who've been truly battered by cuts to the public service have gone on large wildcat, meaning unofficial lightning strikes, and have won some great battles in the last several years. I think that has, in a sense, showed the rest of the labor movement that the right to strike is something that has to be won by striking, that it's never going to be sort of granted. And, public workers, you probably don't know, public workers in the U.S. do not have a full right to strike. But these teachers and education workers took that right and advanced it anyway. And in the aftermath of these strikes in West Virginia and Arizona, throughout the United States, the question of solidarity was not only raised, but it was a lesson taught. So that I see some important lessons about solidarity being learned to not counter the language of identity and difference, but to offer some other alternative framework to begin to break down those social differences.
I was talking to Rick Fantasia about his article, In America, Identity Replaces Solidarity, which originally appeared in the August 2019 edition of Le Monde Diplomatique. It's available on the website at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can read every edition of the paper going back over 20 years, as well as exploring other resources such as maps, images, the podcast archive, and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of content online to entice you to become one, and full details on how to go about it. In the words of the late John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again soon for another interview with one of our contributors. And until then, thank you very much for listening. And goodbye.